You've just entered the No Delusion Zone, and I'm David DeBatto. Today, my very special guest is Dr. Jason J. Smart. Jason is a political advisor who has lived and worked in Ukraine, Moldova, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Latin America. Due to his work with the democratic opposition to President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, Smart was declared persona non grata for life in Russia in 2010. His websites can be found at jasonjsmart.com, americanpoliticalservices.com, and he can also be seen where he writes regularly for the Kyiv Post as a senior editor, and that's kyivpost.com. And it's my great pleasure to welcome back to the No Delusion Zone, Jason Smart. Welcome back, Jason.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it.
You bet. Well, as I said off air, it's interesting times, and there's certainly no shortage of things to talk about. All right. Well, let's start with the obvious. Your thoughts on the statements, the press conference. Let's go back. The phone call that was made on February 12th, which I believe is a Tuesday, between President Trump, President Putin, and then the subsequent press conferences that were held by President Trump and the new Secretary of Defense here, Pete Hegseth, about the contents of that phone call and some further statements about the position of the United States on a possible peace agreement or ceasefire in Ukraine.
So I think that there's a few different things. I think that usually we jump and look at the headline, but there's something sort of interesting here. I mean, it's a basic rule of communications and analyzing communications that every message has a recipient who is supposed to receive it, right? So it's not really for all of us, I think, that the messages being sent from the White House are being sent out. Look at the forum where it's being done. It's not being done on Twitter, which is our Truth Social, which is what would typically happen if it's for the American electorate. It's happening in different forums. So there's two different audiences I think that we're aiming for here, or that the White House was aiming for. One group are those who are in Europe, obviously, because they're at this conference with JD Vance, so that they get a message that the US is stepping back, so that they have to step up what they're doing. That's one of the messages. The second message, I think, is actually Russia, specifically Putin. And of course, as a negotiation strategy, nobody would say it's a great idea to start off by saying what you're willing to give up. So why would they do that? I don't think that the people there that are handling this are totally clueless. I think that they are doing this because there's actually a reason. And I think the reason is that Russia has not shown that it's interested to begin negotiations. And so they needed to publicly signal that they were interested and willing to do it in a fashion that Russia might find to be acceptable. Now, I think that's a mistake in the way they've done it for a number of reasons, but neither here nor there. I think that the audience whom they wished to receive this message was specifically the Kremlin and some European leaders.
I agree with a lot of what you said, and I disagree with some of it. What about the fact that not only was President Zelensky, NATO, and the EU kept in the dark, at least allegedly kept in the dark, but certainly not part of the initial phone call? And how was that in any way a wise strategy to kick off negotiations for a ceasefire in Ukraine?
So I don't know exactly with which degree they are informed or not. So let's start with that. We're not certain. We do know that Zelensky spoke to Trump immediately after Trump spoke with Putin. So that is a good sign. Of course, my view is very biased. I think that, Ukraine should have a center role in everything that's happening here, be the one that's directing the process, but it's not apparently what's going to happen at this moment. So looking at what is happening, though, I am, of course, concerned if Ukraine truthfully is being left out. But for an initial phone call, I am not surprised at all that Trump would decide that he wishes to speak to Putin alone. I mean, Zelensky said he won't speak to Putin, so I don't think there's really a way to include him into that. But as far as it goes, if Trump really just want to get a lay of the land and understand what was acceptable or unacceptable to Putin to begin the process of negotiations, what would that format look like? Where would they possibly meet, et cetera, then, I don't think it's wholly so bad. I mean, once again, the headlines don't excite me either. But I do try to look at this a little bit deeper and say, what does it necessarily mean, or what does it portend for the future? And I think that the sort of overtures the White House is making now is indicative of the fact they've had troubles with Russia so far. I don't think it's smooth sailing with the Russians as they thought it would be. And more than that, I think that the Russians are being Russians, and it's very typical. I mean, even the Soviet period is the same way. Before they even begin negotiations, they're already negotiating. They get you to negotiate away things. They already try to understand everything that you're willing to part with to begin negotiations. So they stomp their feet and make a big deal. They say they have red lines, and we're not even going to talk about beginning negotiations until you get rid of all these different things that were or that are bothering us. But that's already part of the negotiation, and that's already a huge step in negotiation. And Russians, it's literally, I mean, there's a lot of written about this during the Soviet period. It's the way that they operate. It's just a standard part of their thing. And I do sense, though, the White House probably is missing that. They don't understand that this is just a normal thing. The fact is, even if Russia is desperate to negotiate, they don't say that. They go through a whole process of, playing hard to get before they will come up with it.
You know, Jason, there's been so much going on here in the last 3 weeks, of course, since the January 20th inauguration of President Trump. And, what he's doing right now, in my opinion, with the negotiations or the beginning of negotiations with Russia is just something that he said he was going to do. It's a standard Trump. You throw out all kinds of stuff. You create chaos. You create sensationalism in the press. And he's done that with just one phone call and the headlines that have come out. But you're right. You made some excellent points. Of course, you are a Russia and Soviet specialist. You know how they negotiate, and you just elaborated or illuminated some of that. But here's the thing: Trump doesn't. Trump has no idea. And yes, he has advisors who do. There's no question about that. But Donald Trump has a history of not listening to his advisors, the bull in the china shop kind of a thing. And I kind of get the sense that that's what's going on here. He's trying to one up Putin, and Putin is not going to be one-upped, certainly not by Trump. He's, as we all know, an ex-KGB agent, and he is buttering up Trump. He's telling him exactly what he wants to hear. The common sense phrase that Trump put out there, that he's so proud that Putin said to him, that was calculated. I don't think that Trump does get it, and that I'm afraid for Ukraine that he's going to be bamboozled, and that he said he's going to he doesn't really care about Ukraine. Let's be honest, he really doesn't. This is a transactional deal for him, and I'm afraid he's going to play into that, and Putin is just gonna slam him. I'm sorry, that's how I feel. Do you disagree with that? You think that Putin is or Trump is savvy enough to see through Putin?
I wouldn't exclude that there'd be significant problems. And, at the same time, I think that there's a lot of different factors here. One thing is that Donald Trump is that he he very often gives very conflicting messages, like total reversals of what he had said earlier. And he just sort of flows with that, which I have no doubt whatsoever confuses the Russians as well, because they're not really sure what his red lines are. He'll say one thing and just do the absolute opposite the next day. So actually, as far as that goes, that might actually work in our interest. But the other thing is that I think when we look at what different things have come out of the White House that are sort of contradictory recently that are interesting, is, for instance, the whole deal about $500 billion worth of rare earth metals. So most of that, the vast majority of that in Ukraine is located where the current line of battle is, but it's also located in occupied territories. So how exactly can we expect to get that unless those territories are liberated? And I wonder at points if that's not just a signal actually to Russia that the US has desire for it, to see if the Russians will be willing to part with that. I have no way, we have no way of knowing what the great strategy is here, assuming there is one. But that there are things that are contradicting, because that is in contradiction to talk about the 1991 borders. That is in contradiction to, de-escalation, though they don't call it de-escalation anymore. They call it, less involvement of the US. There's different things that are contradictory. And some of it, I think, is undoubtedly confusing the Russians. But I agree with you, is that there are people around who should know better, that do know better. Marco Rubio being a good example, General Kellogg being another great example. But they seem to have been sort of sidelined. As far as I could tell, they're not playing a pivotal role in a lot of what's going on. We saw just recently when Mark Fogel, the American who'd been detained in Russia for the past 3 years, was released. It wasn't the State Department, it was Witkoff, a billionaire from New York who does property development, happens to be a friend of Donald Trump's, flew there in his private airplane and negotiated. And he's the special envoy to the Middle East. But, Moscow is not the Middle East. So why he was going there and doing this, not really sure. But it's a sign that, Trump is picking those whom he trusts, those who he knows, and not subject matter experts.
No, and I think, Jason, there's a possibility that also this is a sideline for him. This is not his main focus as Asia is, the Middle East is right now, or
Mhm.
specifically China. And that's not a good sign. Let me make another point or ask you a question. Actually, one of the pivotal issues in this, of course, is NATO, not just NATO's involvement, the future or lack thereof of Ukraine in NATO in at any time in the future. And Trump and now Hegseth have made it pretty clear that NATO is not in Ukraine's future. I think that's a really stupid tactic to say at the very beginning. John Bolton had a great, statement about that, saying that they've already ended negotiations before it even began. I really don't understand, and maybe you can explain this to me, why the Trump administration, has this big phobia about even the possibility of saying that Ukraine has a future in NATO at some point. Why is that such a sticking point with them?
I assume that's really just a trade-off. What's happening is that they've already identified this as being a red line per se for Putin, and they've decided that it's something that they are willing to be transactional about. To say that, listen, there's not going to be a NATO membership because at this point we understand that Moscow's not going to sit down and talk unless we guarantee that. Obviously, I think it's beyond problematic. I think it's a mistake for many, many, many reasons. But just as a basic point of strategy, I think that the people involved in this have enough sense to know that you don't start giving things away. The only reason I can imagine they're doing that, as I said, is that they simply have not succeeded so far in enticing the Russians to begin peace talks. And I think that, the White House, specifically Trump, is burning to get a deal of any sort because he talked about this so much during the campaign, so much during the election, that he needs to come up not empty-handed. So unfortunately, I think that's going to lead to a lot of very, let's say, very quickly made decisions that might not work out great in the long term, but might get, on paper, something resolved now that he can take credit for.
Well, I agree with you. And it comes back to the point I made just a couple of moments ago, which is I think this is a sideshow for him. I don't mean that it's completely irrelevant, but it's not its main focus. If it was his main focus, he could have said that, no, they're going to belong to NATO. And if you don't at least agree to that as a starting point, we're going to continue. In fact, we're going to increase the shipment of arms to Ukraine until accept that. And then we can sit down and talk again. But he's not doing that. The whole fact that he won't even mention that there's a future for Ukraine in NATO gives me the opinion that they've already made a decision. Not, I won't say throw Ukraine under the bus, although I actually do believe that, but I believe that they've come up, at least at this point, in really giving in to most of the points that Putin wants, that allowing him almost no concessions. Like you just said, Trump wants a deal. He's going to get a deal because he won't lose face. He's never going to be one-upped by Putin by saying he couldn't make a deal, that Putin withdraws entirely, and now Trump has to make a decision of, putting in American boots or increasing the amount of arms. No, he's going to make some kind of a deal. And Jason, I fear that that deal is going to be just catastrophic for Ukraine.
I agree. I think that there's a lot of reasons to be very concerned. At the same time, I think that we have to really see what happens in the next few days. At this point, it's all speculation, right? We don't really know. Unfortunately, I obviously do agree with you that I think the best way to begin it is just to give an ultimatum to Putin and then just start arming the Ukrainians to the teeth. Obviously, that's the best way. I mean, it's no doubt about it. But if your priority is not that, but your priority is rather to get a quick deal, so you could say, I got a quick deal, then I guess you would probably go this route. So we could see, I mean, once again, I think the communications here is sort of fascinating. So if we break these different things down, why are people doing what they're doing? Why are they saying what they're saying? In the case of Trump, I think that what he's communicating is Ukraine is really not what interests him. It's a liability he has to deal with. And so the faster he can get rid of this problem, the better off he is. And that's truly the way he analyzes it. I don't think there's more to it. I don't think it's being pro-Russian. It's just being opportunistic and self-interested and totally disinterested in the future of what happens to Ukraine. It's not based on principle. It's based on expediency.
I'm so glad you said that because so many analysts, pundits, prognosticators, or what have you on the internet and social media try to read so much into what Trump is saying and doing, specifically with this negotiation for Ukraine, and there's just not that much there. I mean, it really isn't. You just said this. He says what he thinks at the moment he doesn't have a strategy for Ukraine, Jason. He really doesn't. His strategy is make a deal. Let's make a deal quick and let me, Donald Trump, get the most out of it. Not the United States per se. How can I come out of this looking the best? Have you, I'm sure you have, read the most recent statements from Zelensky? Let's talk about the communication coming from the Ukrainian side. He said pretty emphatically today, I believe, and as well as late yesterday, that no, NATO's got to be part of this. We're not going to accept anything less than that. It's got to at least be in our future somewhere. To exclude us totally from NATO is not something we can agree with. What do you think about his thoughts? Where is he going with this?
So I think, listen, I think Zelensky's also in the same situation. What Zelensky might say publicly versus what he is willing to accept are going to be very different things. So Zelensky's audience is who? I think Zelensky is able to communicate through back channels what it is that he's willing to do or not willing to do. But what he says publicly has to be aligned with what the Ukrainian public wants, which is clearly NATO membership. So it's a non-starter for him to say, we're willing to make a deal with the Russians or already start giving things away before the negotiations began. That would just be totally unacceptable. So I don't see him doing that, and I don't see him changing his policy position publicly unless there's something that already comes up and they say, listen, but in exchange, the Germans, the French, and the Americans are going to give us security guarantees, and in which case, NATO, well, it'll come later. Okay, I could sort of see the argument for that, but I cannot imagine him saying to anyone that, yes, NATO is no longer a top priority. He has to maintain that. I mean, that's absolutely vital for him being able to survive as a president.
You're on the ground a lot in Kyiv. You're not there right now, but you're there a lot. You live there most of the time, or a lot of the
Yeah,
time.
of course. Of
What's
course.
your sense of? Let's pursue what you just said. I know I agree with you. Zelensky has to make some public statements, just as any leader does for the domestic audience. What happens behind the scenes? That's very often something else. What's your sense? What's your take? What are you hearing from the Ukrainians, the average Ukrainians, not the officials, the Ukrainians, about any possible peace deal? If they're thrown under the bus, if in fact that happens, that they're just left out there and it is actually a surrender, what's your sense of what they are going to do? Are we looking at a partisan type of combat? Are they all going to leave the country and go to Poland? Or what's your sense is what's going to happen with the Ukrainian civilians?
So it's a really good question. So obviously at this moment, there's a lot of apprehension, there's a lot of concern, a lot of tension, a lot of worry, which I think is well-founded. It's because we're really not clear what's going to happen next. I mean, nobody's clear what's going to happen next. So there is legitimate reason to worry. At the same time, I think that majority of people, the public documents, as public polling would probably differ. But once again, I don't think people honestly answer a lot of questions when it's very sensitive. But I think that, we have to see what happens next. If we talk about issues like Crimea, I think for the average Ukrainian, and looking at the numbers, they would say, can we stand 5 more years of war or, thousands more losses for Crimea? And they'd probably be willing to understand why we have to separate with Crimea, why that argument could be not what they want to have happen, but how that can be forced upon them and say, we're sort of powerless to do otherwise. But then you have the bigger issues. So then we talk about things like I mean, there's no reason to assume that Putin's going to be happy with the territories he has right now. I mean, in the Russian constitution, there's 5 oblast states of Ukraine that are incorporated into the Russian Federation, and it's in their constitution. So I think that Putin undoubtedly is going to push for the liberation of those areas as well. Obviously, this is totally unacceptable to Ukraine that the area that we've been fighting to liberate or that we have defended successfully for 3 years is just going to be given away to the Russians. I can see that be totally unacceptable. Nobody's going to go along with that. I mean, Crimea is one story. This is like crazy. Why would we give up territory that's not Russia doesn't even have a foot inside of? So I think that will be a big issue, but it's going to be really depends on what these negotiations offer or do not offer. I mean, my own viewpoint, as you're well enough aware, is extremely pro-Ukrainian, extremely anti-Russian. So my viewpoint is, though, out of sync probably with even people in Ukraine because I'm so far to the extreme. But at the same time, I think that there's the reality of what happens next and the fact that there needs to be long-term security guarantees. As I said, even if it's not NATO, if it comes through and it's going to be the major countries of NATO, I think that's acceptable for everybody because the reality is, if you think of NATO, you're not thinking about Portugal. So if the other countries that are the significant powers are willing to really back Ukraine, that's a great step. And I think people will be able to understand that, for what's going on right now, that NATO is not going to happen in the short term. And let's be honest, is that the U.S. policy, that is the White House's policy, is only for the next 4 years. The next guy who shows up could very well change that policy and allow Ukraine to get into NATO. And everybody knows that. So, I mean, Trump's policy is not the US's permanent, never to evolve policy. It can very well change.
Jason, I hope I'm wrong, but I believe that the Trump administration is going to throw Ukraine under the bus. I don't see any subterfuge here. I don't see any misdirection. I certainly don't see any sophistication in their message. Yeah, they're clumsy, but other than that, I think they've been pretty straightforward ever since Trump tried to strong arm Zelensky into giving information on Joe Biden's brother or son many, many years ago, and for which he got impeached. I don't think he has a soft spot in his heart for either Zelensky or Ukraine. In some ways, this is payback, revenge, which this is really important to him, revenge and getting back at people who he believes has wronged him. I believe that if it's possible, he's going to absolutely screw Ukraine. I'll say it as bluntly as I can. And I feel horrible about that. I just made a whole podcast about that where I already apologized to the Ukrainian people. And that how horrible I feel. I pray that's not what happens. But when Hegseth and Trump both said that it's unrealistic for Ukraine to believe that they can regain their territory pre-2014. It just it made my heart sink. Nothing new. I believe that they would say that, but to have it said so clearly before negotiations have even started was just absolutely horrible. Let's talk about the security guarantees. Because without security guarantees, as you just said, there's really no agreement. At least it's not worth anything. Putin's not going to agree to Ukraine ever joining NATO, which we both agree is nonsense. That should be the first article that they debate and just have it shoved down Putin's throat. But that's not going to happen. Without another ironclad security guarantee, whether it's a bilateral agreement with France and the UK or Germany, or it doesn't matter, any number of NATO nations getting together to agree to defend Ukraine with a no-fly zone, with all of the anti-drone and counter-drone and anti-aircraft that they need, with the rules of engagement to shoot into Russia, to wherever the missiles or aircraft are coming from. No agreement it's going to be worth a damn because Putin's not going to stop. Europe doesn't get that yet. Trump's never going to get that. And if he does, he doesn't care. What do you see can be the only security agreement that's worth a damn that Zelensky's going to agree to and that Putin would agree to that would actually work, at least in the short term?
So, it's a good question. I think that, as I said, the major European countries are probably the most important. Unfortunately, I think the U.S., due to the Trump administration, will not be willing to sign into that in a way that they should, at least. Now, I can imagine, and actually, this is a rumor I heard 2 years ago, which is that Ukraine, one of the strategies they should implement is to invite more American corporations in as fast as they can, whether it's helping rebuild the electricity industry or whether it's the manufacturing or specifically weapons manufacturing. And the argument was twofold, and they both make sense. One argument is that once more American companies come in here, then there's a reason for the U.S. to get behind this. I mean, then the U.S. has money in this. They have something riding on this. And then the U.S. will do more. But secondly, which I thought was sort of funny, but I mean, funny in the sense of like brilliant, I like the ingenuity, is that they said, look at the largest industries inside the United States. You look at something like the arms, the military industrial complex. You look at something like GE or Westinghouse. They have massive lobbies. They spend millions and millions of dollars a year lobbying the Congress. So if they have a huge investment inside of Ukraine, that gives enough reason for them to start lobbying the Congress saying, hey, we can't afford to lose hundreds of millions of dollars if the Russians invade. You have to protect our investments. And actually, I think that's a very reasonable argument. I like that argument. But further ahead, yesterday I talked to Ambassador James Gilmore, who was U.S. Ambassador to the OSCE under Trump 1. And we were discussing this at length. What does this look like? And I fully subscribe to his viewpoint. I mean, fully, totally, is that, the reason, and I think this is unfortunately one thing that Biden did horribly at, was the messaging about Ukraine and why it matters. I support Ukraine because I support Ukraine, but secondarily, fully, I understand and know to be a fact that it is critical for America's national security interest. It is critical for Europe's national security interest that we defeat Russia in Ukraine. And it is the best single thing we could do for our own national security. There's not a question about it. I don't think there's anyone who studies Russia or foreign policy engaging with Russia or military policy engaging with Russia who would argue differently. And so this is in our own national security interest. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of people in America, especially, feel that it's like a charity case. It's a country that's got its hand out, just begging for help all the time, and the money just disappears, God knows wherever. They don't understand that this is part of something much, much larger, and that Russia is our enemy in a capacity that's far greater than what I think people appreciate. I mean, Russia's ties to these other states, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, these are all countries that are pretty bad and they create a lot of problems. But they're also tied to a lot of really bad people, such as Hezbollah, such as Hamas, such as narco cartels. And so we realize that Russia's playing a significant role in trying to destabilize us globally. It's not just in Ukraine. Ukraine is a battle. It's a very important battle, but it's a battle in a global war that Putin is waging against us. So when you put that into context, I think it makes it much clearer as to why we should be supporting Ukraine. But unfortunately, I think that the vast majority of people simply didn't get that. They didn't get the memo as to why we were sending these aid packages. There's a period where it seemed like it was every couple of weeks, there was another couple $100 million going to Ukraine, but nobody really understood why. I mean, why are these weapons or why are those ones? And why is that aid important and that one's not important? And why nobody understood it. And I mean, I was living it full time. And I'm telling you, I didn't understand all of the different packages and why this one was needed today versus next week. And nobody explained it. Nobody in the White House explained it to anybody. And that was a huge, huge mistake because I think that's how we got in the situation that we're in today.
I agree with you. And in fact, I've made some statements and announcements on this channel recently that in collaboration with some other podcasters, are going to be putting together some initiatives to try to get that message out to the American people. Because the Democrats just did a horrible job at doing that. Now the Republicans are doing a horrible job at doing that. In fact, President Trump has said repeatedly, both before he became the president again and after, that it's kind of a black hole, that all the American money is getting poured into Ukraine and we're not getting anything back about it. He erroneously and falsely threw out the number, I think it was yesterday, that we've given Ukraine $350 billion worth of military aid, which is not even close. And even if you took the raw gross number, we got most of that back in sales for our defense contractors. It's really been very, very, very little. And as you know, I think the number in terms of our budget, defense budget is I don't know if it's 3%, but it's way below 5%. It's not a huge part of our expenditures. That's never been communicated to the American people. And like I said, I'm going to be doing some outreach on that personally, as well as some other podcasters. But again, let me pin you down. What do you see is going to be not that you're going to give me the answer exactly, but what is Zelensky and the Ukrainian people and NATO going to accept, and Putin going to accept as a security guarantee? Forget NATO. They're not going to be able to protect Ukraine. They're not going to be able to join NATO. But what European countries are going to be able to sign on or will sign on to protecting Ukraine, to actually have boots on the ground and be a tripwire that if Putin attacks, and he's going to at some point in the future, they're actually going to respond. They are going to physically defend Ukraine. How do you see that happening without Ukraine being a part of NATO and having an Article 5 type of a situation?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and it's a very complicated question because the fact is, we can guess a lot, but knowing what's going to happen is very hard. So all of international politics depends on domestic politics, right? So I think what's going on with French elections, German elections, or whatever other elections are going to come up in the near term is going to be sort of important. There's a lot of politicians that can gain at this point by showing that they are very supportive of Ukraine. British politics, fortunately, is much more supportive of Ukraine, both on the labor and the conservative side, than is the U.S. The U.S. is terribly terribly broken. And so I think that there's hope for different countries, but I would imagine that the British are a key role. We've also got the countries such as the Baltic states, Poland, who undoubtedly would be part of this. Finland, I think, would very likely be part of this. There's a host of other countries that be willing to contribute to security guarantees. Now, how would that security guarantee look? I would unfortunately imagine it would be much more similar to Budapest Memorandum than it would look like NATO agreement. And what that means is one is sort of optional, the other one sort of, well, even NATO is actually still sort of optional. I mean, it says that every country should respond as it deems necessary to respond. It doesn't say you have to have soldiers on the ground. So it's not as rock solid as a lot of people would hope to think. It's a little bit more weak. So I think that if you have an agreement that's sort of open-ended like that, where there's still some sort of a wiggle room, it'll be much easier to get a coalition of countries in Europe. And I think that Russia would not be actually that threatened by it. And the reason would be simply that they know when push comes to shove, there's a lot of countries that might say, sure, I'm on board for that. But when it comes to actually doing something more than sending some assistance, would do very, very little, if anything. So they can also count on that. So I think that there is a reason to believe that something will shape up, and the Ukrainians will, for the next, indefinite future, will have to put a serious emphasis in rebuilding their military, but also increasing the demand for Ukraine with the Europeans. That is to say, why Europeans would want to have more investment there or have more military located there or to do more military cooperation there. I mean, for instance, if Ukraine all of a sudden started producing more 122, 155, whatever it is, and they became an integral producer of that for NATO countries, then all of a sudden you're part of the map. I mean, you're part of the general quilt that provides security for Europe, and your role in that becomes greater. And so your value goes up. And that's something they have to be focusing on. And I think it has to be focused on the political front, obviously, the diplomatic front, the economic front, but also the military front. If Ukraine's not trying to expand its influence in Europe on all three of those, then it's probably going to lag behind. But undoubtedly, Vladimir Putin will not give up now. There's no doubt about that. Vladimir Putin is a criminal and he is a threat to humanity. And that's not going to change because there's an agreement or not. So I hope that the European countries have enough wherewithal to realize that Putin, their main adversary, is taking a break. He'll sign whatever documents today to, rebuild, regroup. But when it comes down to it, he's going to be reattacking anytime. So Europe needs to get more serious about its own security as well.
Listening to that, and I agree with everything you're saying, but listening to that, listening to many of the statements coming out of Munich, where, as we all know, a security conference is being held as we speak, has been for a couple of days, and comparing what's going on and being said in Munich today to what was said in Munich in 1938 is just so eerie. Because what I'm hearing, not necessarily from you, Jason, but from all the parties involved, is that there will be an agreement. There will be peace. There will be a ceasefire. Something has to happen, but it's going to look like you said. It's going to look like a Budapest agreement. It doesn't seem as if NATO, the bigger countries in NATO, have the will, have the political will, and some of them don't have the economic or military ability to put boots on the ground in Ukraine. Sure, they'll sign anything saying that they'll come to Ukraine's aid. But, I've interviewed and talked to a number of people who know more about this than I do. We're talking about a force that has to be at least 150,000 strong or more and has to be there for a long time. And that doesn't include the logistics, the supplies, the intelligence, the command and control centers. It's a staggering investment that the NATO, certainly individual NATO countries, or even two of them or three of them together, cannot do without the U.S. support. And the U.S. right now has said they are not going to support this. They're certainly not going to put boots on the ground, short of NATO boots on the ground. And when I say NATO, one, two, three or more countries on the ground and a no-fly zone guaranteeing the security of the Ukrainian territorial borders, it ain't going to happen. Putin's going to just roll. He's going to roll. He's desperate for a pause so he can rearm, retrain, re-recruit, and he's going to roll. So this is crazy. It's just crazy. And it makes me feel really, really, really bad because I think that's what's going to happen. I think you're right, that's what's going to happen. And that's a travesty.
Certainly, I agree. What it concerns, one of the things that's very alarming is that for the sort of interesting background to this is that the economic situation of the two countries is quite different. So Russia's economy is a total mess for a lot of different reasons. Inflation being one of them, the fact that nobody is able to do anything that's not government related. The banks have lent out just massive amounts of money to the military. But in short, the military industrial complex is sort of what keeps Russia going. Without that, they'd have a disaster of an economy, much worse than it is today. So that's one side. So Putin needs to keep this going. So he can't just, the day after the war ends, what they're spending, what is it, 35-40% of their national budget goes to military defense, which means Ukraine. And it's like 89% of their military is engaged in Ukraine. So when you look at that, what do you do? Well, how are you going to stop 40% of your economy from operating, 40% of your national budget that produces the national budget from operating? You can't. They have to keep it rolling. The Ukrainians are on the flip side of that. The Ukrainians, because they receive foreign assistance, are in a bubble. It's not a natural economy. It's a manipulated economy in the sense that, it's not their own tax revenue that necessarily goes in everything else. It's, foreigners who are sending weapons. So they don't have to pay for it themselves, which is good because it allows them to prop up their economy in other sectors. Now, the war ends, let's imagine, or there's a ceasefire. We can be pretty sure that countries will stop sending assistance very quickly. For one, because they'll save the money. For two, they'll say, well, this just ended. So if it's going to start up again, it's not going to be tomorrow. We'll have time on our side. The Ukrainian military will be reduced drastically. I mean, drastically. I would imagine that, we're talking about 90% of people probably laid off, which is, to be fair, a lot of them were drafted, so they were happy to go home. But let's imagine more 90% get laid off or sent home. Then we've got a very bad situation because at this point we have Ukraine that's unarmed, a military that's greatly reduced. It's definitely not going to be the size enough to cover all of its fronts. It's definitely not going to be at the size necessary or at the capacity necessary to do what it's doing today. And if I was Putin, and God forbid this happens, but if I was Putin, I'd look at this and say, this is great. The Ukrainians have this false sense of security. The Europeans have a false sense of security. The Americans have a false sense of security. And right now, since they've given away, let all the soldiers go home and all the weaponry, well, they're not getting new stuff. And even if they got new stuff, they don't have enough men to arm it all or to use it all. That's when I would strike. And, I think, and sounds very conspiracy theory, I know. But the theory I've had for a while is that, and more than a year, is that Putin will go through the stage and he won't wait to get very far. I don't think this can be 10 years like some people say to rebuild. I think we're talking in the capacity of a few months at the longest. Wait to who becomes the next president after Trump. But even within a few months, within a year, I can imagine a false flag attack within Moscow or across the border where they'd blame the Ukrainians, which would then justify being able to reinvade Ukraine. And knowing that the current U.S. president seems to have some sort of a sympathy for what Russia tells him, I am afraid that he could take them at their word. And if he were to do so, that could have really dire consequences because the Russians are famous for using false flag attacks concerning civilians. And if something like that were to happen, I could totally imagine Putin calling saying, I had no choice. What would you do if you're in my situation? It's common sense to defend your people. And I can imagine our president decide not to get in the way of Putin's aggression.
Which is exactly why Germany invaded Poland. I mean, again, this is all going back to 1938, to Munich, to 1939. You made a great point that Ukraine, if they don't get the security guarantees that they should, are going to have to really step up. They're going to have to, really increase their defense expenditures, their defense industry, their military. But here's the thing, and we all, well, not all of us know this, but Putin has been saying forever that part of any negotiations or peace settlement, if there is one, is that Ukraine has to not only denazify whatever that is, it has to demilitarize. It has to greatly reduce its military and become a neutral country. So it won't be a part of NATO. No NATO country is really going to put boots on the ground there to protect it. It's going to drastically reduce its own military, and it's not going to be able to have a sizable defense industry. What more does Putin need? A written invitation to invade? You're right. I think it's a matter of months. And I think that the NATO leaders, they know this. As always, they're just being cowards. They don't have the political will to admit this. They don't want to ask their people to confront this. They certainly don't want to raise taxes in order to defend Ukraine. And it's just a horrible situation. And again, that's why I feel that Ukraine's going to be tossed under the bus, and there's no reason for it. There's no reason for it. If Biden had given them the weapons that and training that they needed and ammunition 3 years ago, or at any time during the last 3 years, you and I wouldn't be sitting here talking about this. We might be having a beer somewhere, but we wouldn't be talking about Putin rolling into to Kyiv or to Ukraine in a few months, because he's going to do it, Jason. And after that, he's not going to stop there. The Baltics are shivering in their boots. They know what's coming. And I don't know. I sound like I'm a crazy man, but it just makes me so crazy because nothing's being done about it except throwing Ukraine under the bus. And I don't want to go on and on about that. I'm going to leave the last word with you and ask you, to make some predictions. What do you see in the next 90 days? Because this will be taken care of in 90 days or before. What do you see happening? What's your best prediction?
Well, based on history, I think a few things will happen. I think they'll begin the peace talks in Saudi Arabia. From there, there will be weather ballooning, a lot of different ideas. We'll see that the Ukrainians will release stuff in the press to see how the public reacts. The Russians will do the same thing. The White House will do the same thing. To just see what the public reaction is, see what's really acceptable or not acceptable to the public. Um, Based upon that, I think the next step would be first step would probably be release of prisoners. I imagine that would probably happen in the near term. I'd imagine it's probably gonna be Orthodox Easter. They would do the full release of all the prisoners on one side, full release of prisoners on the other side. I'd imagine shortly thereafter, Zelensky would probably call for elections because one condition that undoubtedly the Russians are going to say when they say denazified, they mean Zelensky. I assume that means, and the Americans are already pushing for the Ukrainians to do elections, which they cannot do legally because their law says that if there's a state of martial law, you cannot have elections, which we're in a state of martial law for obvious reasons. So there's nothing strange about the electoral situation in Ukraine, but nothing here nor there. Many people on the right seem to believe there is. So I think that they will be pushed to have elections in the near term. And let's be honest, if you end the war without regaining the territory, your chance of re-elections can be quite low. You're gonna have a lot of difficulties. So I think that Putin understands that, and so he'll push for that. So I imagine we have the elections, I think prisoner releases, the talks, the weather ballooning. The final conclusion of all this, I think, will be some sort of an agreement, and where there's going to be, unfortunately, at this point, it looks like, this is not what I'm hoping for, but from what I can tell, it would probably be freezing the conflict near its current borders, with some sort of acknowledgement that Ukraine would not seek to regain those territories. Now, what Ukraine get in return is the question for me, though, because we never discussed this, but we've seen that Ukraine is very adept at, for instance, executing Wagner Group mercenaries in Mali and doing things like this. Ukraine could continue, and I hope it does continue, to assassinate Russian leadership going years into the future, because I'm pretty sure that won't be in the agreement. I'm pretty sure that they could figure out how to drone strike senior Russian military officers who engaged in the war in Ukraine. I'm pretty sure they could figure out how to poison them. I'm pretty sure they could figure out how to make residences of Putin explode. And I hope that continues. So, because eventually this will boil up again. This will heat up again. This is not over. This is going to continue. So it's a matter of not, if, it's a matter of when. So that's a long term, is that I think that Ukraine will be finding some sort of revanchist war, though it could be covert and quiet for the foreseeable future.
All right, Jason, we're going to have to leave it there on a pretty gloomy note, but I don't think the news allows us to say anything more. So we'll leave it there. You and I will speak about this again in the near future, I'm sure, because this is coming to a head very soon. Just like events here in the United States over the last 3 weeks, the events in Kyiv in Ukraine regarding the any peace settlement, ceasefire, it's happening very, very fast. It's probably going to happen faster than you and I both think. So again, Jason J. Smart, thank you very much for coming back to the No Delusion Zone, and let's talk again soon. You take care, stay safe, and as always, stay sane.
Thank you. Good seeing you.
Same here.